Hi, my name is Julia Kuo, and I'm the illustrator behind the picture book I Dream of Popol, written by Livia Blackburn, edited by Connie Sue, and just released by Macmillan Books. So I Dream of Popol was a really special book to work on because it was the first time I could tell my own family's story through my illustrations. Everything I was drawing felt like it came from a first-hand experience. I actually lived in Taiwan for a year when I was young, in the same house as my ama and gong, and I visited throughout the years, especially as an adult. It's important to say that Livia's story is not my exact story, but it comes much closer to anything I've ever drawn before. With all other illustration projects, I usually have to learn about and research the subject matter in order to be accurate, and that just wasn't an issue here. As for working with a team that was totally Taiwanese American, things just went really smoothly. I'm sure Livia, Connie, and I are all used to code switching as we move from one world to another. But here, there was no need to explain ourselves or for me to explain the choices I was making with these illustrations. For example, I included a lot of objects that are familiar to most Taiwanese and Taiwanese Americans, like a datong rice cooker, house slippers by the door, even a huge 20-pound bag of rice sitting in the kitchen. And because Livia and Connie are Taiwanese American, they're familiar with all of these things too. When it comes to picture books, authors and illustrators don't really interact much during the actual making of the book. My process pretty much started once Livia was done with hers, although I know she was shown the art at various stages and was able to give feedback. I really worked a lot more closely with Connie and her team. As the editor, Connie bought Livia's manuscript and then selected an illustrator for it, so I'm just really lucky that I got to be that person. I usually start with creating a couple sample images to establish the style of the entire book. From there, I made a couple more sample images to make sure I was on the right track, and then I went into the sketches. I did rough sketches for all the spreads so that we could get an idea for flow and balance from page to page. Once that was approved by Connie's team, I had a couple months to just dig into the finishes and develop each page to what you see in the book now.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about process. By the time I was working on the finishes for I Dream of Popol, I was actually in Taiwan. And so this kind of provided a great opportunity to take reference photos when I was just out and about living my daily life there. And so I'm just going to show you some of the reference photos I took. I love running along the riverfront park, and so I came across this group of seniors who got together to stretch and dance in the morning. This is a common sight, actually, if you stick around Taiwan long enough. Here's an opasang on his bike. I always take lots of sneaky photos on the subway, and I'm sure that I'm going to get caught one day. But I mostly just like capturing photos of normal everyday life. This is a crew just cleaning up around the neighborhood and picking up trash. I like these just very natural poses. You know, I can pose friends to try to get the look that I want, but there's nothing like just emulating real life. All right, so let's pick one to draw today. I think I will draw this woman sweeping, because I like her shape. So just looking really quickly at the I Dream of Popol style, I draw in a lot of different styles, so each project kind of has its own language. And if we look at this one, everything is composed almost entirely out of shapes, but there's line work used sparingly to kind of delineate some details. So mostly shapes, just a little bit of line. So we'll put this over here to remind ourselves what to strive for. So I work in Photoshop, which is pixel based, excuse me. And so that means that everything is only as big as you draw it. So I usually try to draw a little bit bigger in order to accommodate for different uses. And so I just look at things based on the shapes they make. And I'm going to try to kind of translate her into an I Dream of Popol color palette. So I'll stick to those reds, greens, and yellows. And I try to stay somewhat organized in my layers. You know, you have to label them or else you're just gonna get 100 unlabeled layers in Photoshop and not know what any of them are. So she has either short hair or pulled up hair here, but I'm gonna give her a ponytail because I think that shape will add some visual interest. Just drawing her face. I know I'll have to accommodate for the mask later on. It's kind of a shame we can't see her facial features. So we'll add this mask over. It's very fitting for COVID times. And then the gathers in this mask are a good opportunity to use a little bit of that line. All right, so onto her clothing. She's got this super bright pink, fluorescent pink vest on, but I'm going to change that to that bright red that we use in I Dream of Popol for the little girl's dress. So one thing that I do a lot is I use the lasso tool to fill in the shapes. It's a lot faster than just coloring it all in. I also use a lot of hotkeys, and hotkeys are, for example, like if I want to erase, I could literally go over to here. I think that's the erase tool and erase here. But another way of doing it is I could just press the E button and then my brush would turn into an eraser. So I won't get too deep into that, but there are a lot of tricks in Photoshop that make things a little bit more efficient. So I really love this bright red color. The little girl in I Dream of Popol wears it. And actually, I have 2 other books coming out where the main characters also wear a super bright red. And, you know, it works for I Dream of Popol and another one of the books because the characters are Chinese and this is a very auspicious color. But I simply just love this color. In fact, I call it Hot Cheeto Red because it reminds me of my favorite snack. So it's kind of like, you know, rumply at the bottom, but because I Dream of Popol has such clean shapes, I'm going to give it a sharper edge to make it look stiffer and for you to better understand that it's a vest. Okay, so she has these gloves on, but I'm just going to pretend that she doesn't. That's the beautiful thing about illustration. You can make your world however you want it. And it helps to, since we didn't really have to show details of the face because it's all covered by the mask, this is what I would have done for the face, is just kind of indicate a few lines here and there to show like, oh, these are how her fingers are separated from one another. And I like using, you know, a limited color palette. If I could use a color for a couple different things, it's a lot better. And I like to draw upon the same color palette and use derivatives of the same colors. That way it feels a lot more harmonious. Okay, we'll finish the rest of the broom later when after we finish her legs. So back to clothing. You know, I know that her legs are actually like this. Here's the front leg and then here's the back leg. But we're just using shapes and we're not actually using line work in the clothing. So it's just gonna look like a big blob of black, and you're expected to understand that these are 2 legs. Visually, our eyes do tell us that. You know, in a different book with a different style, I would have been inclined to be like, oh, okay, you know, draw in the separation between the 2 legs for you to better understand it, maybe even in the clothing here. But that is not how I Dream of Popol looks. You can see that the clothing shapes are just flat, very simple color fields. So we're not going to do that. And I love these little boots. Okay, so now that we've finished the rest of our body, we can finish the broom because we know where it ends now. And so you can tell that the broom is just like one of these old school brooms where it's all these different hairs just kind of bound together by a little bit of metal. And so now I have the decision, like, do I like draw it like that? You know, what it actually is, all these separate hairs. But that doesn't really look like the way that I Dream of Popo looks. So I think it should be one flat shape. We can't see the bottom of it, but I assume that they're uneven lengths. So what I'll do is kind of imply that there are breaks in it and inconsistencies without actually having to show them all. And that's kind of how we did the little girl's bangs. We can add a little bit of detail. Maybe a few implied lines. Okay, so that's my lady sweeping the street. I hope this gave you a glimpse into how I illustrated for I Dream of Popo, and thank you for listening.
I like to encourage new illustrators to be as prolific as possible and to use their spare time to create their dream projects. Once they get going in their career, they'll be taking art direction and collaborating on every project, and it takes a lot of skill and experience to get the portfolio piece that you want out of these assignments. That's why personal projects are so valuable. You can make what you want however you want to do it. So you put it out there for the world to see, and now art directors scrolling through your site can look at a tangible example of your dream project, and maybe they'll hire you to make it. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me talk about my process and to share about I Dream of Popo.